The rain fell softly over the small town of Willow Creek, its gentle patter forming a mournful melody against the rooftops and windows. In the heart of the town, a modest cemetery nestled between rows of ancient oak trees bore witness to the quiet grief of a handful of mourners. Among them stood 8-year-old Clara Sullivan, a tiny figure dwarfed by the enormity of her sorrow. Clara's mother, Sophie Sullivan, had passed away after a long battle with an illness that had drained the family of both hope and resources. The polished mahogany casket resting on the grass, poised to be lowered into the earth, symbolized not just an ending but a gaping void in Clara's young life. Beside her stood her grandmother, Marjorie, her weathered face etched with pain as she tried to console her granddaughter. "Mommy loved flowers," Clara whispered, clutching a single white daisy in her trembling hands. "She said they made her happy." Marjorie bent down, wrapping an arm around Clara's frail shoulders. "She loved you even more, darling," she said softly. "You were her greatest joy." The priest began his solemn prayers, his voice blending with the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The small gathering of mourners, mostly distant relatives and a few neighbors, listened in respectful silence. As the prayer neared its end, a sudden murmur broke through the quiet. A figure approached from the far end of the cemetery, his steps unhurried but purposeful. Dressed in a long black coat and a slightly weathered fedora, he carried an old wooden trunk that looked like it had been salvaged from a pirate ship. The small crowd turned, their whispers growing louder as the man stepped closer. "Is that Johnny Depp?" one of the neighbors gasped, her voice filled with disbelief. The murmurs rippled through the group as the actor, unmistakably himself, removed his hat with a respectful nod. His eyes were somber, his expression filled with empathy as he made his way to the graveside. The priest paused mid-sentence, his brow furrowing at the unexpected arrival. Marjorie straightened, her protective instincts flaring. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm despite her grief. "Can I help you?" Johnny Depp stopped a respectful distance away, setting the trunk on the ground. His voice was gentle, almost hesitant. "I'm sorry for the intrusion. I didn't mean to disrupt the service. My name is Johnny, and I'm here because of Sophie." He turned his gaze to Clara, his eyes softening. "Your mother." Clara's brow furrowed in confusion, her grip tightening on the daisy. "Mommy? Did you know her?" Johnny nodded. "Not personally," he admitted. "But she wrote to me. A letter. She spoke about you, Clara, and how much she wanted to leave something behind for you." Marjorie's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "A letter? Sophie never mentioned this to me." Johnny opened the trunk slowly, the hinges creaking. Inside lay an assortment of items that immediately caught Clara's eye: a delicate silver locket, an old sketchbook, a pair of worn ballet slippers, and a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon. "These belonged to your mother," Johnny explained. "She entrusted me to deliver them to Clara. Sophie wanted her to have these pieces of her life, memories to hold on to." Clara stepped forward cautiously, her curiosity outweighing her hesitation. Her small hand hovered over the locket before picking it up. "This was Mommy's," she whispered, holding it to her chest. "Yes," Johnny said, kneeling to meet her gaze. "She told me it was her favorite piece of jewelry. She wanted you to keep it close, like a part of her heart." Marjorie's wariness began to melt as she saw the joy in Clara's eyes. She placed a hand on Johnny's shoulder. "I don't understand why you would do this," she said quietly. "But thank you." Johnny looked up at her, sincerity shining in his eyes. "Your daughter's story moved me," he replied. "I wanted to honor her wishes. She fought so hard, and she wanted nothing more than for Clara to remember her with love, not just loss." The priest, sensing that this moment was far more meaningful than finishing his prayer, stepped aside to let the family have their time. The other mourners lingered respectfully, watching as Johnny helped Clara explore the treasures in the trunk. Among the items was a journal filled with Sophie's handwritten notes, doodles, and pressed flowers. Clara ran her fingers over the pages, her young mind absorbing the traces of her mother's love and creativity. "Mommy wrote this?" Clara asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "Every word," Johnny said. "She wanted you to know her thoughts, her dreams, and how much she loved you." As the service came to a close, Johnny stepped back to let the family say their final goodbyes. He stood under the shadow of a towering oak tree, watching as Clara gently placed her daisy on the casket before it was lowered into the ground. Her small shoulders shook with sobs, but the locket around her neck glinted in the fading sunlight, a symbol of connection, not loss. Marjorie approached him as the mourners began to disperse. "You've given us something precious today," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't thank you enough." Johnny shook his head. "It's not about thanks," he replied. "It's about keeping Sophie's memory alive for Clara. She deserves that." The rain began to fall harder, and Marjorie guided Clara toward their car, the trunk carefully carried in Johnny's hands. As they reached the vehicle, Clara turned back, her wide eyes filled with something Johnny recognized, hope. "Will you visit us again?" she asked softly. Johnny smiled, his voice gentle. "If you'd like, Clara, I'd be honored." As the car pulled away, Johnny stood alone in the rain, watching until it disappeared down the winding cemetery road. His heart felt heavy yet full, knowing that he had helped a little girl find a connection to the mother she had lost. And yet, deep down, Johnny sensed that this was only the beginning of a journey he hadn't anticipated, a journey of healing, hope, and unexpected bonds. The days following Sophie Sullivan's funeral were marked by quiet grief and tentative steps forward. In the small, cozy home Clara now shared with her grandmother, the presence of the wooden trunk seemed to anchor their memories of Sophie. It sat by the living room window, where soft rays of sunlight illuminated its weathered surface each morning. Johnny Depp, true to his word, visited the Sullivan household 2 weeks later. Clara greeted him at the door, her face lighting up as if she had known him forever. She tugged him inside, eager to show him how she had arranged her mother's belongings. The locket hung from her neck, its silver gleaming against her soft pink sweater. The journal lay open on the coffee table, with Clara's small sketches scattered around it as she tried to mimic her mother's artistic flair. "Look, Mr. Depp," Clara said, holding up a piece of paper. "I'm learning to draw flowers like Mommy did." Johnny crouched beside her, studying the delicate lines she had drawn. "That's beautiful, Clara," he said with genuine admiration. "Your mother would be so proud." Marjorie entered the room, her apron dusted with flour from her baking. "You're spoiling her with all this attention," she teased, though her smile betrayed her gratitude. Johnny laughed lightly. "She deserves to be spoiled," he replied. "And call me Johnny, please." The afternoon passed in warmth and shared stories. Johnny listened intently as Marjorie recounted tales of Sophie's tenacity, her love for art, and her fierce devotion to her daughter. Clara chimed in with her own memories, her young voice filling the room with echoes of her mother's laughter. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Johnny rose to leave. Before he reached the door, Marjorie stopped him. "Johnny," she began hesitantly, "I need to ask. Why are you doing this? You didn't know Sophie, yet you've done so much for us already." Johnny's gaze softened, and he hesitated before answering. "I didn't know Sophie," he admitted. "But her letter, it spoke to me. I've spent so many years surrounded by noise, fame, films, people always wanting something. But Sophie's words were quiet and honest. They reminded me of what truly matters." Marjorie nodded, sensing the sincerity in his words. "Well," she said, "you've become a part of our lives now, whether you meant to or not." Clara ran up to Johnny, throwing her arms around him in a sudden hug. "Thank you for bringing Mommy's things," she said, her voice muffled against his coat. "It's like she's still here." Johnny knelt down, returning her embrace. "She'll always be with you, Clara," he said gently. "And I'll be here too, as long as you need me." Weeks turned to months. Over the next few months, Johnny's visits became a regular occurrence. He would stop by to read stories with Clara, help her with her drawings, or simply sit and talk with Marjorie. It wasn't long before the townspeople began to notice. Willow Creek was abuzz with whispers about the Hollywood star who had seemingly adopted the Sullivan family as his own. One day, Clara's teacher, Miss Jane, stopped Johnny outside the school gates as he dropped Clara off. "Mr. Depp," she said, her cheeks reddening slightly. "I just wanted to thank you. Clara has been brighter lately. More confident. Whatever you're doing, it's working." Johnny smiled, his eyes glinting with quiet pride. "Clara's the one doing the hard work," he replied. "She's stronger than she knows." Despite the joy he brought to Clara and Marjorie, Johnny couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he could do. He noticed the peeling paint on the house, the worn furniture, and the faint weariness that lingered in Marjorie's eyes. The Sullivan family was struggling, and he wanted to help. One crisp autumn morning, Johnny returned with a plan. As he sat with Marjorie in the kitchen, Clara coloring at the table, he broached the subject. "I've been thinking," Johnny began, "about Sophie's journal. She mentioned dreams she had for Clara's future. Things she wanted for her but couldn't provide." Marjorie's expression grew guarded. "We're doing the best we can," she said, her voice tinged with defensiveness. "Clara's happy, and she's loved. That's what matters." "Of course," Johnny agreed quickly. "And you're doing an incredible job. But if there's any way I can support you, financially, emotionally, or otherwise, I want to help." Marjorie hesitated, the weight of her pride warring with her gratitude. Finally, she sighed. "It's not easy to accept help, Johnny. But if it's for Clara's future, I'll consider it." Johnny smiled, relieved. "That's all I ask. A helping hand." The next day, Johnny made a few phone calls. By the end of the week, contractors arrived to repair the house, volunteers from a local charity delivered new furniture, and Clara's school fees were paid in full. Marjorie protested at first, but the sparkle in Clara's eyes softened her resistance. Clara's excitement was contagious as she watched the workers transform their home. "Does this mean our house will be pretty like Mommy's flowers?" she asked Johnny one afternoon. "It'll be even better," Johnny said with a wink. "It'll be your garden of memories." The community of Willow Creek, initially skeptical of Johnny's intentions, began to rally behind him. They donated supplies, cooked meals, and even helped with the renovations. The little town came alive with a sense of purpose and unity, inspired by Johnny's selflessness. But as the Sullivan family's life took a turn for the better, Johnny found himself facing an unexpected challenge, a letter from a lawyer representing Sophie's estranged brother, Greg. He claimed to have a right to Clara's custody, citing her best interests in his financial stability. The letter from Greg Sullivan's lawyer arrived like a thunderclap on a clear day. Marjorie sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she held the official-looking envelope. Across from her, Johnny Depp leaned forward, his face a mask of concern. "Who is Greg Sullivan?" Johnny asked gently, trying not to alarm Clara, who was in the living room drawing her favorite flowers. Marjorie sighed deeply, the weight of years pressing down on her. "He's Sophie's younger brother," she said. They hadn't spoken in years. Greg left Willow Creek after a falling out with Sophie over their parents' inheritance. He wasn't there when she needed him most. Johnny's jaw tightened. "And now he's claiming custody of Clara?" Marjorie nodded, sliding the letter toward him. "He says he has the financial means to provide for her better than I can." Johnny scanned the letter, his expression hardening as he read the carefully worded arguments. "This isn't about Clara," he said firmly. "It's about control. He wants to claim her to satisfy his own ego." Marjorie's eyes filled with tears. "Johnny, I've raised Clara since she was born. I've done my best to give her a loving home. I can't lose her now. Johnny reached across the table, covering Marjorie's hand with his own. "We won't let that happen," he said with quiet determination. "We'll fight this. Together." The custody battle. The weeks leading up to the court hearing were a whirlwind of preparation. Johnny enlisted the help of his legal team, who worked tirelessly to build a case that showcased Marjorie's devotion to Clara and the stable environment she provided. Letters of support poured in from neighbors, teachers, and even Clara's pediatrician. Meanwhile, Johnny spent every spare moment with Clara, ensuring her days were filled with laughter and creativity. He brought her to art classes, introduced her to new hobbies, and even invited her to visit a movie set. For Clara, these moments with Johnny felt like a dream, a beacon of light in a confusing time. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Clara asked a question that caught Johnny off guard. "Mr. Johnny," she began, her voice small, "if Uncle Greg wins, will I have to leave Grandma and you?" Johnny knelt beside her, his gaze steady. "Clara, no matter what happens, I promise you'll never be alone. Your grandma and I will do everything we can to make sure you stay where you belong." Clara nodded, her trust in him unwavering. She leaned into his side, clutching the locket around her neck. "Mommy would want that too," she whispered. The day of reckoning. The courtroom was tense as the judge entered, her expression calm but unreadable. Greg Sullivan sat with his lawyer, his polished appearance a stark contrast to the humble warmth exuded by Marjorie and Clara. Johnny sat beside them, his presence a quiet but powerful statement of support. Greg's lawyer began with a calculated argument, painting Greg as a financially stable and well-meaning relative who only wanted the best for Clara. Greg himself spoke with measured charm, claiming he regretted his estrangement from Sophie and wanted to make amends by caring for her daughter. When it was Marjorie's turn, her voice trembled at first, but her love for Clara shone through every word. She described the bond they shared, the memories they had built together, and her commitment to giving Clara the life Sophie had dreamed of for her. Finally, it was Johnny's turn. As he took the stand, the room seemed to hold its breath. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "I've had the privilege of spending time with Clara and her grandmother over the past few months. What I've witnessed is a home filled with love, resilience, and unwavering dedication. Marjorie may not have the financial resources Greg claims to have, but what she offers Clara is priceless, a connection to her mother's memory and a sense of stability that no amount of money can replace." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "I've seen the impact of losing Sophie on both of them, and I've also seen how they've begun to heal together. To take Clara away from the only family she's ever known would be a tragedy." The judge listened intently, her expression softening as Johnny spoke. When he finished, Clara was called to the stand. Though nervous, she clutched her locket for courage and spoke from her heart. "I love my grandma," she said firmly. "She takes care of me and tells me stories about Mommy. And Mr. Johnny is my friend. I want to stay with them." A verdict and a new beginning. After what felt like an eternity, the judge returned with her decision. "The court finds that Clara Sullivan's best interests are served by remaining with her grandmother, Marjorie Sullivan," she announced. Relief washed over Marjorie and Johnny as Clara ran into their arms. Greg, though clearly displeased, rose from his seat and left without a word. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, eager for a statement. Johnny shielded Clara from the cameras, his protective instincts kicking in. He gave a brief remark, praising Marjorie's strength and Clara's resilience, before guiding them to the car. Carrying Sophie's legacy forward. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new normal. Johnny's visits to Willow Creek became less frequent as his filming schedule picked up, but he remained a constant presence in Clara's life through letters, video calls, and occasional surprise visits. Inspired by Sophie's story and Clara's courage, Johnny started a foundation in Sophie's name. The Sullivan Foundation focused on supporting single-parent families facing medical crises, providing them with resources, financial aid, and emotional support. Clara often helped with the foundation's work, drawing pictures and writing letters to the families they assisted. "Mommy would like this," she told Johnny one day. "Helping people, just like you helped us." Johnny smiled, his heart full. "She would be very proud of you, Clara," he said. Epilogue. Years later, as Clara stood on a stage receiving an art scholarship, she wore the same silver locket that had once belonged to her mother. Johnny and Marjorie sat in the audience, beaming with pride. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but together, they had built something beautiful, a legacy of love, resilience, and kindness that would endure for generations.